Dr. James Mitchell was a 34-year-old emergency room physician at St. Mary's Hospital in Seattle. He had been working night shifts for 8 years and knew something that most people didn't. Veteran night shift workers had a saying about the hours. Between 2 and 4 a.m., they called them the dead hours, the time when the barrier between the living and the dead seemed thinnest, when the strangest and most unexplainable events occurred in hospitals around the world. Dr. Mitchell had always been a man of science. He believed in facts, medical evidence, and rational explanations. But after 8 years of night shifts, he had witnessed enough unexplained phenomena to make him question everything he thought he knew about reality. It was during these dead hours, on a particularly foggy October night, that Dr. Mitchell would experience something that would forever shatter his scientific worldview and force him to confront the possibility that some things simply could not be explained by medicine or science. The night had started like any other. Dr. Mitchell arrived at 11 p.m. for his 12-hour shift, relieving Dr. Sarah Chun, who looked exhausted after a particularly busy day. The handoff was routine: 3 patients in observation, 2 waiting for lab results, and 1 elderly gentleman with chest pains who was being monitored overnight as a precaution. "Pretty quiet night," Dr. Chun had said as she gathered her things. "Mrs. Rodriguez in bed 3 is waiting for her daughter to pick her up in the morning, and Mr. Thompson in bed 7 just needs to be monitored for his heart rate. Nothing too dramatic." By midnight, the E had settled into its typical nighttime rhythm. The harsh fluorescent lights had been dimmed in the patient areas, and the usual daytime chaos of ambulances and worried families had given way to the subdued atmosphere that characterized the graveyard shift. Nancy Williams, the night nurse, was a veteran of 23 years. She was a calm, no-nonsense woman in her mid-50s who had seen everything the night shift could throw at her. She and Dr. Mitchell worked well together, having developed an efficient routine over the past 3 years of working the same shifts. Around 1 a.m., Mrs. Rodriguez was discharged when her daughter finally arrived to take her home. Mr. Thompson's heart rate had stabilized, and he was sleeping peacefully. This left only Lisa Parker, a 28-year-old woman who had been brought in after a minor fender bender. She had a mild concussion and was being kept for observation, but she was stable and dozing. The E was now eerily quiet. Too quiet, Dr. Mitchell thought as he reviewed patient charts at the nurse's station. Nancy was updating medication records, and the only sounds were the gentle beeping of monitors and the distant hum of the hospital's ventilation system. It was at exactly 2:17 a.m. when the first strange thing happened. All the automatic doors in the ER began opening and closing simultaneously. The pneumatic whooshing sound echoed through the empty corridors like the breathing of some massive mechanical beast. Dr. Mitchell looked up from his charts as the sound continued. Whoosh, pause, whoosh, pause, in a rhythmic pattern that seemed almost deliberate. "That's weird," Nancy muttered. Looking up from her paperwork with a frown, Dr. Mitchell walked to the main entrance doors and checked the sensor system. The diagnostic panel showed green lights across the board, no malfunction detected. Yet, the doors continued their mechanical breathing, opening and closing every few seconds with perfect regularity. "Probably just a glitch in the system," Dr. Mitchell said. But something about the synchronization felt intentional, as if something was triggering all the sensors simultaneously. The doors continued for exactly 7 minutes, then stopped as suddenly as they had started. The sudden silence felt oppressive, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Dr. Mitchell returned to his charts, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air in the EO felt different, heavier somehow, charged with an energy he couldn't identify. At 2:33 a.m., the elevator at the end of the main corridor began moving between floors on its own. The soft ding of the arrival bell echoed through the hallways as the elevator traveled up and down, stopping at every floor in the hospital. Nancy walked over to check the elevator control panel. "That's strange," she said, pressing the call button. When the elevator arrived and the doors opened, it was empty. The digital display showed it had been stopping at every floor: basement, ground first, second, third, fourth, then back down again in an endless loop. "Should we call maintenance?" Nancy asked, clearly becoming unsettled. Dr. Mitchell checked with security via the internal phone. The guard on duty, a man named Carl who had been working at the hospital for 15 years, confirmed that no one was calling the elevators and that all floors appeared empty on the security cameras. "Maybe there's an electrical issue," Carl suggested. "Old building, you know. Sometimes the systems get a little wonky." But before Dr. Mitchell could respond, something else began happening. The lights in the EO started dimming and brightening in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Not the rapid flickering of faulty electrical connections. This was a gradual, deliberate dimming that lasted several seconds before slowly brightening again. The pattern continued for several minutes, and Dr. Mitchell noticed that it seemed to match the rhythm of a slow heartbeat. Dim, bright, like the hospital itself had developed a pulse. Nancy was now visibly nervous. She had worked enough night shifts to know when something wasn't right, and everything about this night felt wrong. "I've never seen anything like this," she whispered, glancing around the EO as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. At 2:45 a.m., they heard footsteps in the corridor directly above them. Slow, deliberate footsteps that echoed with an unusual resonance, as if the person walking was deliberately trying to make as much noise as possible. The footsteps moved from one end of the corridor to the other, then back again in a steady, measured pace. The problem was that the floor above the EO was the hospital morgue, and it was supposed to be completely empty. The morgue was locked. After hours, and only authorized personnel with special keycards could access it. "I'm calling security," Nancy said, reaching for the phone with trembling hands. "Wait," Dr. Mitchell said, placing a hand on her arm. Something deep in his gut told him that they needed to investigate this themselves, that calling security might somehow make things worse. "Let's check it out first." Nancy looked at him as if he had lost his mind. "Check out the morgue at 3 a.m.? When something is clearly wrong with the building." But Dr. Mitchell was already moving toward the elevator. Years of medical training had taught him to investigate symptoms rather than ignore them, and whatever was happening in the hospital felt like a symptom of something much larger and more disturbing. Reluctantly, Nancy followed him to the elevator. As they waited for it to arrive, the footsteps above continued their slow, measured pace. When the elevator doors opened, they both hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. Ride to the morgue level felt longer than usual. Neither of them spoke as the elevator climbed, but both could feel the temperature dropping with each floor. By the time they reached the morgue level, their breath was visible in the suddenly frigid air. The elevator doors opened with their usual soft chime, but the sound seemed unnaturally loud in the cold silence. The corridor leading to the morgue was dimly lit by emergency lighting, casting long shadows that seemed to move and shift as they walked. The footsteps had stopped, but the oppressive coldness was even more intense here. Dr. Mitchell estimated the temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees from the A, which should have been impossible given the hospital's climate control system. As they approached the morgue, Dr. Mitchell noticed that the heavy security door was slightly ajar. This should have been impossible. The door was equipped with an electronic lock that required a keycard and a 6-digit code. More importantly, the door was designed to automatically lock when closed, and it took considerable force to keep it from sealing completely. "That door should be locked," Nancy whispered, her voice barely audible in the cold air. Dr. Mitchell approached the door carefully and peered through the gap. The morgue was illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights that cast everything in stark clinical detail. But something was wrong with the scene inside. One of the examination tables was moving. Not vibrating or shaking from some mechanical malfunction. It was actually moving across the floor in smooth, deliberate motions. The heavy steel table, which normally required 2 people to move even when empty, was gliding back and forth across the room as if it weighed nothing at all. Dr. Mitchell pushed the door open wider and immediately wished he hadn't. The movement of the table was hypnotic and disturbing, but what they saw next made Nancy gasp and grab Dr. Mitchell's arm. On the white tile wall, condensation was forming in patterns that looked like letters. Slowly, as if an invisible finger was writing in the moisture that was appearing despite the room's normally dry environment. Words began to form. It'll be me. The letters appeared one by one, growing clearer and more defined with each passing second. The condensation seemed to be forming from nothing. There was no obvious source of moisture in the room, and the climate control system maintained a constant low humidity to preserve the bodies. Then the temperature dropped even further, so suddenly and severely that the metal instruments and surfaces in the room began making sharp cracking sounds as they contracted. Dr. Mitchell's breath came out in thick white puffs, and he could feel the cold penetrating through his scrubs and coat. "We need to leave now," Dr. Mitchell said, but as he spoke, more words began forming on the wall. "Dio1 to Lia V, Emia Elo1E." The words appeared faster now, the condensation forming and reforming in different areas of the wall, as if multiple invisible hands were writing simultaneously. And then they heard it, a voice so faint it might have been the whisper of air through the ventilation system, but too clear and too human to be anything but speech. "Don't leave me alone. Please don't leave me alone." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the cold walls and mixing with the sound of their own rapid breathing. It was a woman's voice, weak and desperate, filled with a loneliness so profound that it made Dr. Mitchell's chest ache. Nancy was pulling at his arm now, trying to get him to leave, but Dr. Mitchell found himself strangely compelled to stay. Something about the voice was familiar, though he couldn't place it. Double quotes. "Please. Double quotes." The voice came again, stronger this time. "I'm so cold. So alone. The examination table stopped moving and began rotating slowly, as if something invisible was circling around it. And then Dr. Mitchell saw something that made his blood freeze in his veins. On the table, which had been empty moments before, the outline of a human form was becoming visible in the condensation that was now covering every surface in the room. The outline was that of a small woman, lying on her back with her arms at her sides, the exact position that bodies were placed in for examination. "Who are you?" Dr. Mitchell whispered, his scientific mind still trying to find a rational explanation, even as his intuition screamed that they were dealing with something beyond the realm of medicine. The condensation outline became clearer, more defined. And then the voice answered, so close now that it seemed to be speaking directly in his ear. "Room 3. I died in room 3. Alone. Suddenly, Dr. Mitchell remembered. 3 days ago, during his previous shift, there had been a patient in room 3, an elderly woman named Margaret Foster, who had been brought in with chest pains. She had been stable. Her daughter was supposed to come pick her up in the morning. But sometime during the night shift, the memory hit him like a physical blow. Margaret Foster had gone into cardiac arrest at exactly 2:15 a.m. The monitors had shown distress, but there had been a problem with the automatic door sensors. They had been malfunctioning, opening and closing randomly, and the sound had masked her calls for help. By the time they realized what was happening and reached her room, it was too late. She had died alone, calling for help that couldn't hear over the mechanical breathing of the malfunctioning doors. "Margaret?" Dr. Mitchell whispered. The outline on the table seemed to sit up, though nothing visible was there. The condensation shifted and changed, and suddenly the room was filled with the sound of crying, deep, heartbroken sobs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "I called for help," the voice said, clearer now, filled with an anguish that made Dr. Mitchell's eyes water. "I called and called, but nobody came. I died alone, and nobody came." Nancy was crying now, tears streaming down her face as the full horror of the situation became clear. They had failed Margaret Foster. The hospital had failed her. She had died alone and afraid while they were just a few yards away, unable to hear her cries for help over the noise of malfunctioning equipment. "I'm sorry," Dr. Mitchell said, his voice breaking. "Margaret, I'm so sorry. We didn't know. We couldn't hear you." The crying continued for several more seconds, then gradually faded to silence. The condensation on the walls began to evaporate, and the examination table settled back into its normal position. The temperature in the room slowly returned to normal. But on the wall, one final message appeared in the condensation. "Unkou." Then everything was still. Dr. Mitchell and Nancy stood in the morgue for several more minutes, neither speaking. Finally, they turned and left, walking back to the elevator in complete silence. When they returned to the AIA, they found that all the building's systems had returned to normal. The doors were functioning properly, the elevator had stopped its endless cycling, and the lights were steady and bright. They didn't speak about what they had seen until the end of their shift. As dawn broke over Seattle and the day shift began arriving, Dr. Mitchell finally broke the silence. "We need to change our protocols," he said quietly. "We need better alarm systems. Multiple redundancies. We need to make sure this never happens." Again, Nancy nodded, wiping away tears she hadn't realized were still falling. Margaret Foster deserved better. "Yes," Dr. Mitchell agreed. "She did." That morning, Dr. Mitchell submitted a formal request to be transferred to day shifts. When asked for his reason, he simply wrote, "Personal medical issues requiring consistent sleep schedule." He never worked another night shift again, but sometimes, on quiet mornings when he was alone in the hospital, Dr. Mitchell thought he could still hear Margaret Foster's voice echoing through the corridors, no longer pleading for help, but simply saying thank you over and over again. The hospital implemented new patient monitoring systems the following month, with multiple redundant alarms and communication channels. The official reason given was improving patient safety protocols, but Dr. Mitchell knew the real reason. They were making sure that no one would ever die alone and unheard again, not on his watch. Not on anyone's watch. Margaret Foster's death had taught them all a lesson about the responsibility they carried as healthcare providers, and about the thin line between life and death that they walked every day. Some lessons, Dr. Mitchell realized, could only be learned during the dead hours, when the veil between worlds was thinnest, and the voices of the departed could still be heard by those willing to listen.